In 1857, a Chartist leader, Ernest Jones, said these 6 words that haunted the British Empire. If they massacre us, we taught them how. He was talking about India, about the sepoy uprising that exploded across the subcontinent, but he wasn't mourning the British dead. He was celebrating. He urged the British working class to catch what he called the glorious contagion of successful revolution, to adopt the spirit of the sepoy host against their own ruling class. 8 years later in Jamaica, another rebellion, another crackdown. But this time, the reaction didn't just split radicals from conservatives, it split Darwin from Dickens, scientists from poets, friends from friends. This is a story that's usually told about over there, in Jamaica or India. But that misses the biggest point, because every act of colonial violence caused fractures back home. Every massacre abroad forced Britain to ask, if they can do this to subjects over there, what stops them doing it to citizens here? This is how the empire broke Britain in two. But before we get to the rebellions, we need to understand something that might seem strange at first. Why would any British worker care what happens in India or Jamaica? The answer is brutal, and it's economic. Ernest Jones had a metaphor for the British economy. The golden crust. The golden crust on which our oligarchy stands is breaking like ice floes at the April thaws. The crust was Britain's system of exchange and credit. It looked stable, but it depended on one thing: cheap colonial labour. George Padmore made this argument. British financiers opened coal pits in colonies where miners worked for 8 pence a day. As long as that labour existed, British labourers could always be replaced, could always have their wages driven down to the same level. The same applied to textiles, agriculture, anything that could be offshored. Sounds familiar, right? Ernest Jones warned, mismanagement of India would be felt in our mines and mills, our farms and factories. And Richard Congreve published an appeal to the working men of England, arguing that the same elite oppressed both the working class in England and the colonial subjects abroad. It hit the nail on the head. This created a trap for the British workers. They couldn't improve their own situation if the cheap colonial labour existed to undercut them. But colonial labour didn't just happen to be cheap. It was kept cheap by force. Every rebellion, big or small, created a crack in that crust for Britain. And by 1857, the cracks became huge. The official story of British India is simple. A civilising mission that would eventually, gradually, lift the subcontinent towards modernity. In 1853, 4 years before the rebellion in India, Ernest Jones was already calling this a lie. In the People's Paper, he argued that the universal confiscation of soil was a crime that would eventually demand retribution. He was dismissed as a crank. And then came May 1857. The sepoy uprising explodes over northern India. British civilians are killed. And in response, total war, almost annihilation. The official mind of the empire, as some called it, couldn't process this. They didn't understand how it could come to this. Jones quoted them, puffed up with an overweening idea of their own excellence, incapable of seeing how people hated their rule. But for Jones, it meant something else. A patriotic assertion of a gallant people's rights. This is where he encourages the British working class to adopt the mentality of the sepoys against their own government. He's talking about sedition. Richard Congreve, who we've already seen, went through his own personal transformation as a result of this. He comes to a simple conclusion. Either you fully conquer these places and subdue them, or you withdraw. He's the first prominent British voice to suggest Britain leaves India. And that would be a significant first step. So 1857 split Britain into 2 camps that would never reconcile. One side said you had to maintain the empire with brutal force. The other said the rebellions proved that the whole thing was rotten to the core. And it wouldn't take long before the next incident that would make the rivalry even more heated. 8 years later, a smaller rebellion in a smaller colony would cause Britons to have to decide. October 1865, Morant Bay, Jamaica. A protest over land rights and other things turns violent. 18 white colonial officers are killed. In response, Governor Eyre declares martial law. But what follows was not a crackdown. It was terror. To call the response disproportionate would be underselling it. 1,000 homes burned, people flogged, near 500 people at least executed, including George William Gordon, who wasn't even at the rebellion in the first place. They transported him into the martial law area and then had him executed, just because he had given the former slaves ideas above their station. The news of this, both the destruction, the executions, the obvious imbalance, the execution of a clearly innocent man. He could not be guilty. And this is where the split really starts. 2 committees form almost immediately. First, led by John Stuart Mill, you have the Jamaica Committee, with support from Thomas Huxley, Charles Darwin, and Herbert Spencer. And their argument is pretty simple. If this kind of behaviour is allowed in the colonies, then the English Constitution is dead. What stops that being used in Ireland tomorrow, which it eventually will? What stops that happening in London? Frederick Harrison says, "Whose turn, be it colony or citizen, might not come next?" On the other side, you have the Eyre Defence Fund, as in Governor Eyre. This is led by Thomas Carlyle, a man whose book I once read before I realised how much of a racist he was. Great. With support from John Ruskin, Alfred Lord Tennyson, and Charles Dickens. Their argument is simple. Eyre's not a villain. He saved Jamaica from black insurrection. Black insurrection. Carlyle himself labelled critics rabid philanthropists. He said they would weaken the empire. This wasn't polite disagreement. These were former friends who now hated each other. Dickens versus Darwin. Science versus literature. Britain versus Britain. The Jamaica Committee didn't want to just call out the violence. They wanted prosecutions. They wanted prosecution for murder. The government declines to charge. No great surprise. But from 1866 to 1868, Mill and his group pursue private prosecutions. Grand juries are called. Evidence is submitted. And indictments never come. Goldwin Smith blamed the Tory upper class's sympathy for colonial violence. Mill comes to the conclusion that the British public are struggling with whether dependencies should be under law or military license. But while the upper class has made its choice, so has the working. Reynolds' paper The Beehive says, "The two islands are one and the same." In 1866, in response to what's happening in Jamaica, indignation meetings are held across the country. And in Clerkenwell Green, effigies of Eyre are burned on a pyre. There's no prosecution, but the British government does investigate. The Royal Commission calls Eyre's measures wanton and cruel. In Jamaica, the colonial government dissolved itself. The island passes into direct crown control. Exactly the same thing happened in India in 1857. And Eyre? He's never convicted, but he's never given another post. He retires to Devonshire on a government pension, of course. The system had been tested, and on the whole, it protected its own. But the main outcome, as Thomas Huxley suggested, is that people found their true political voice. Their various beliefs were now irreconcilable with each other. The Jamaica affair proved something important. The empire's critics couldn't win through the courts. The system wouldn't allow it. You can't dismantle the master's house with his tools. So they found another way. London itself. Over the next 70 years, London became something that it was never meant to be. The headquarters of its own opposition. London became a melting pot of dangerous ideas. Colonial revolutionaries and European socialists get together, discuss ideas. They use the empire's own freedoms against it. In 1922, Shapurji Saklatvala becomes the first anti-colonial voice in the UK Parliament. He's the first person to use the House of Commons as a megaphone for the colonised. In 1927, the Simon Commission promises gradual reforms for India. Saklatvala calls it humbug. He says, "Between slavery and freedom, there is no middle course. There is no such thing as gradual reform." His colleagues are outraged. How dare he say this about the empire? Earl Winterton attacks him personally. And they do this because he's exposed the blocked feedback loop. The Royal Commissions are a way of killing time in response to genuine pressure. It cools everything down just long enough that people start to forget. That same year, 1927, in Belgium, the League Against Imperialism is founded. The attendees include European socialists like Ferner Brockway, George Lansbury, and then you have people like Nehru from India and Lamine Senghor from Senegal. In 1929, the Meerut conspiracy case. 31 Labour activists are prosecuted for trying to deprive the king of sovereignty. The defendants include 3 British comrades, Philip Spratt, Ben Bradley, and Lester Hutchinson. The League Against Imperialism turns the trial into political theatre. They shine a light on what's happening. The cruelty of the colonial empire is being exposed to an international audience. And in 1935, the turning point. Italy invades Ethiopia. George Padmore and CLR James break with the Communist International. They create a new term, colonial fascism. The argument is simple. Democratic Britain uses the same tactics in its colonies as Hitler does in Europe. The evidence? Detention camps and passbooks in Kenya. They argue that what Europeans call fascism is just colonialism coming home. They've had to live with it already. But ultimately, British democracy was a lie. It depended on dictatorship abroad. The fractures that started in 1857 hadn't healed. They had multiplied. Now the colonies weren't just rebelling, they were naming the system for what it was. The name stuck. Colonial fascism. The beast that Britain forced on its colonies was now being called what it truly was. Ernest Jones saw it coming in 1857. It took another 80 years for someone to truly name it. And if you're curious about what happened in 1857, watch this video to see what took place in India during the mutiny. And if you want to know what happened in Jamaica in more detail, without just the top level details, because it is a really fascinating story that gets into the heart of slavery and the post-slavery system within British colonies, then watch this video on Jamaica. They're kind of a trilogy together. You don't have to watch any of them in any particular order, because this video obviously does the high level summary of them, and those videos get into the more specific things. You don't have to have seen them in order. If you watch this first, watch them whenever you want. It's fine. Hopefully you've liked this little trilogy of videos. It's been fun to make, despite how depressing some of the content can be, especially the Indian mutiny and some of the details in there. But yeah, hopefully people like this. See you later.